Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Aphra Behn, author of Eve Bites Back, an alternative history of English literature. It's published by One World. It'll be released on October 13th. Anne is a cultural historian and biographer. She has written Sounds and Sweet Airs, The Forgotten Women of Classical Music, and Patriot or Traitor, The Life and Death of Sir Walter Raleigh, as well as biographies of Beth Throckmorton, William Shakespeare, and John Milton. She's a visiting fellow at Kellogg College, University of Oxford. So, the patriarchy. As an old man, perhaps, perforce, I am a part of it. Example, over the course of my 40-year career in law and construction, and as a bookseller, I've had at least 50 secretaries. I call them that. Each has been a woman. All of my employees at the bookstore, but two, old men like me, have been women. But that's because the men I have hired were incompetent. My hair has always been cut by a woman, and anyone who has cleaned my house or my hotel room has been a woman. So is that part of the patriarchy? I don't know. But anyway, in the past 15 years, I've interviewed over 1,000 authors, and most of them have been women, except for 10 neuroscientists, 9 of whom have been men. So the patriarchy is a thread through this book, but it doesn't intrude at all. And the portraits of 8 women authors, 7 of whom, with which I had been unfamiliar, taught me a great deal about the treatment of women who dared to write, did so under great duress, and yet gave us works that are both well worth reading and remembering. And of course, the one we all know is Jane Austen. Anna paints portraits of each, and interspersed is a great deal of wit and humor and sideways swipes at me, and with some success at erasing. No, the men, not like me, the men who attempt it with some great success at erasing the achievements of these pioneers. So let's learn from them, from Anna, as I conclude my usual labyrinthine introduction. Welcome, Anna. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me. I already want to come back at you on so many things you've already said.
I know.
I'm currently being dazzled by the late autumn or the early autumn British sun, which is such a rarity. So I'm just going to completely interrupt this introduction, and by closing a curtain. Hold on. Excuse me.
I have the early autumn afternoon sun.
Okay, there we are. Much better. I can see you now. Sorry about that.
No problem. So my daughter, as I said, is also Anna. When she's at home, greets me irritatingly as she comes down the stairs with a morning, "Down with the patriarchy." And when we discussed this interview, she said, "I mean, up with the matriarchy, but women are full of drama and pettiness."
Particularly young women, I think. Young women, how dare she speak to you like that? No, one of the things I wanted to come back on you about is that one of the themes or the conclusions I came to with every passing page that I wrote is that we are all, obviously, I'm part of a highly functional patriarchy that works to deliver what we think we want to read. And why are we asking women of the past to knock down all the barriers? We should be asking not just women of the present, but men of the present, in the same, you're stepping up to it. And I felt that it's a very powerful thread to the book, that there are true heroes in this book, and they happen to be men, and they supported individual women to achieve the great works of literature that they managed to write. But as you've said, there's quite a few who are gatekeeping and stopping them. Funnily enough, I'm already going off at a tangent, but I saw an amazing premiere of a film about the making of The Wasteland, which is the centenary of publication of T.S. Eliot's great modernist poem, which we all study, we all learn about. And it was a beautiful film, but and at its heart was the story of his relationship with Emily Hale, a young American woman, and as a unfulfilling relationship, a relationship that wasn't fulfilled, but she was set up as his muse. And I came away thinking I'd learned a lot, but I kind of, if anybody said to me again, "Oh, poor Tom, so lonely, so hurt," And he channeled all that pain into The Wasteland, which is a work of genius. I'm not going to knock that over. And I imagined him kind of driving a car, looking wistful, like an Iranian road movie. And you'd see his face, but you'd look behind you and you'd suddenly see women splatted in his wig. And in a sense, I'm just trying to shift the perspective away from the great man driving the car and not looking at the collateral damage of the women who the great men shoved out their way, but looking at the women who actually took that steering wheel and drove, and seeing the world from their perspective. I think I got lost in that metaphor, didn't I?
No, actually, it's quite pertinent to me, because I was just thinking about T.S. Eliot, because I was going to ask you about the canon, from the Odyssey to 100 Years of Solitude, with Jane Austen and Toni Morrison now kind of slid in. But, that's what I've relied on, what I've learned from all my life. And it's also what some of your authors, when they couldn't go to school, read in the libraries of their parents at their homes. But yeah, okay. We'll dig in 1 second. But so what do you think of that the canon really hasn't, I think they're great books.
Yeah.
But they're all written by men.
Yeah. Not all. And the one caveat I'll do, you mentioned that I wrote a book a number of years ago now about female composers. And you talk to people who like music of any kind, and they might be able to name Mozart. If they like their classical music, they'll get up to 10 names, 20 names, what have you. Ask them to name a female composer maybe 10 years ago. Things are changing. Literally, music lovers, classical music lovers would not come up with anybody. You've said that, of course, we all know Jane Austen. If you ask somebody on the street, we're surrounded by female authors. You've had hundreds of them on your show. So it's not that the women aren't there. It's that we value them differently. We value their achievements differently in the past, and we value the kind of work they do differently. And I'm thinking of your hairdresser or childcare and things like this versus neurosurgeons. And there are certain kinds of work in our culture that we value more highly, pay more highly. And there's certainly kinds of literary works. And and it's not just about what women were allowed to write, what they felt they could write, but what, as you say, the legacy. And for example, I've been studying, reading since I was a tiny little girl, absorbing all of this. On my bookshelves, I'm surrounded by works by men, truly great works for which I'm grateful. But there's so many things I don't know about. And when I was looking at 1922 and I saw the lists of the great works that were published then, I didn't see a book that I've now discovered, Juna Barnes's Nightwood, American author based in Paris. You probably know it. I'm ashamed to say I didn't know it. And it's just those gaps. Why are they there? And why aren't we more angry about it, really?
Well, I guess, you know what? Let's dig in, because I should say that the book is written in terms of a chronology. We're talking from the earliest to the most contemporary, which is still not today, which would be a great sequel for you. But let's talk about Julian and Margery. Those are the only two where they're coupled together. So those are two of the 8. So let's just start there. Who were they and why are they so important to you? Because they lead off the book. They're the first.
Yeah, they're the first partly because they are the first. They are the first women to write full-length works in English, which is still a growing, developing language in their hands, in their time. And so Julian of Norwich wrote a remarkable book called The Revelations of Divine Love, which offers a spiritual help to all of us. And in this time of still, trauma in the UK, we've lost our queen. It always reminds me that Julian's most famous phrase, "All shall be well and all manner of things shall be well," such comfort in that, was actually in the stained glass of the Queen's private chapel at one of the palaces. I've forgotten my palace. I'll never become a Dane. So you've got that. It's a remarkable work, theologically so astute, skates close to heresy. But the most interesting thing for me, because one of the things that drove this book is I didn't want to just talk about what was in the books. but the making of them, how these books were made, how each individual woman got the confidence, the self-belief to write in the first place and believe that what her words had value in a world which seriously was telling her every single day over 500 years, shut up. So Julian of Norwich chose a remarkable life. She chose to be enclosed. She was an anchorite or an anchoress as a woman. So she was literally walled into a cell with one window to take in food and another, one window which she could take in food and pass out human waste, and another window from which she could look out onto the main body of a church. So it was attached to a church, and so she could witness mass. That was her life. She was enclosed in there. The burial of the dead, the service for the burial of the dead was recited as she went in. She was dead to the world. But what I love about this is that even as an anchoress, you had ways of showing your devotion. And we might think prayer, or contemplation, or beating yourself with a stick, but also making words, writing was seen as a craft that was allowable. And she ran with that, and she wrote this remarkable work, Revelations of Divine Love. Complete opposite is Margery Kempe. Margery Kempe is out there in the world. Cannot imagine her locked up for a moment. She is completely different in terms of her spiritual journey. She travels manically. Many people thought she was crazy. I think she's fairly unhinged. She's a difficult woman, difficult woman. Does a lot of crying. You kind of want to, Margery, pull yourself together. But my goodness, if you read the book, you will not have to look very hard to work out what my actual secret passions are, because travel is one of them. So I'm with Margery every step of the way. She uses, consciously or unconsciously, her desire to become closer to God, to do a deal with her husband and her church that she is not going to have sex with them anymore. She's going to have no more children. She'll now be married to God, and she'll go traveling. So she gets to Jerusalem.
She did have plenty of children, though, before she...
Yes, we believe she had, and I've forgotten the numbers, but we're talking a lot. Thank you. It's why I do books, not maths. And it's strange, because obviously that's important to the story, because she must become re-virginated in order to devote herself to God. And she has this lovely conversation with Jesus, who comes and sits on the end of her bed. This is all obviously in her mind, kind of, saying, it's okay, Margery, I know you've had sex, but you're still pure in my mind, and you can become, as it were, like a nun, but living in the world, and you will be saved. And that keeps her going. But she has huge run-ins with the church, because she's saying, both these women are saying, and this is the most remarkable thing about them, and they're writing in the late 14th, early 15th century, they are saying they've got a direct line to God. And on the whole, people, particularly women, who say they've got a direct line to God and don't need the church, don't need the state, are perceived as dangerous. And somehow both these women got away with it.
If I look down, I'm taking notes, because I'll forget everything.
Okay.
So, because all of this, but in the old sense of the word, a lot of this is homely, in the sense that, well, for example, when I was researching, apparently she had a cat, so she wasn't totally alone. I think she had a cat, and then
yes, familiar.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then again, I didn't realize she actually had to pay for her lodgings, which, it's like, really?
Yeah. It's one of the things I love about reading both these women's works in completely different ways. Homely is a medieval English word, actually, with such resonance. It doesn't just mean homely as in a bit plain, a bit boring, maybe. It means both women describe Jesus as homely. He's safe and ordinary, which is very comforting to think that it's not some kind of complicated business, or not some big organization that you have to go through, that Jesus will listen to you. And yes, the homeliness, one of my favorite lines is that Margery goes to her husband and basically does this deal and says, look, okay, I'm not going to have sex with you anymore. We're going to have a celibate marriage from now onwards, and I'm going to travel a lot. But in return, I'm going to give up eating meat, fasting on Fridays, as if this is some big thing. And then the manuscript says, and they went off and had a pie and beer together. And it's just, you just think, oh my goodness, I can see them. I can see this couple sitting down, having a pint, having a pie, and just saying, okay, next chapter in our marriage.
The funny thing was, and I thought about this throughout, especially, when we're talking about letters from Turkey and Jerusalem. I mean, I have problems getting to Jerusalem now. How the heck, how did they do this? How, what were they wearing, and where did they stop to get food, and who was helping them out and taking them? How could they do this?
That is such a good question. And as I've said, I love travel. And so I've spent hours and hours and hours trying to work out the details of the practical details, particularly of Margery's travels to Jerusalem, or even just northern Spain, Santiago de Compostela, even across country to another part of the UK. And you this is one of the challenges, you end up being going circular research, because I went to all the authorities and they say, well, we found out about pilgrimage from Margery Kempe's book. And I'm thinking, okay, but I want to know what actually happened. And so I ended up having to, a lot of this ended up on the cutting room floor, because not everybody wants to know exactly how much price of beer is in northern Germany in 1413, but I do. I think for Margery, traveling in groups was essential, obviously, maybe not obviously. She always needed help. And by the time she was doing her final pilgrimage, she was an old lady by their standards. She was in her late 50s, early 60s. She really needed help. And that means huge acts of trust. And that's what I find very a good reminder. As you say, I get worried if a flight's delayed, or I rock up at the station at 11 o'clock at night. And I do not rely on the kindness of strangers, because we've all been trained out of it. So for all the wars and all the disease and all the threats against her body, and she says she is frightened of being raped, she's frightened of being robbed. At the same time, there was this network to support her. As a lone woman, she attached herself to various groups, and she does those incredible journeys. 200, 300 years later, Mary Wortley Montagu, who's I first knew because of her travel writing, completely different. She comes from us, at least in the journey that I describe in the book. She's traveling to the Ottoman Empire, to its heart, Constantinople as it was. And she travels with an entourage of hundreds of soldiers, carriages filled with her women. She's got lots of servants with her. And she needs that because she's going through an absolutely devastated Europe. I mean, she crosses battlefields where she's still seeing the bodies decaying, and she's going into enemy territory as well, because of course the Christian West was still fighting with the Ottoman Muslim East. So she travels very differently when she's a young woman. She needs a book of her own, because my goodness, she got a taste for it, and she became much more like Margery as she got older. She just took herself off and did amazing journeys, much more independently.
Yes, when you're talking, and I'm going to skip around now. I do want to get to everybody. When you're talking about Mary Montagu, one of the things that was, I don't know, maybe pivotal in the book was what she wrote, which is, I am a woman, I'm reading it, without any advantage of education. All these was writ at the age of 14.
Yeah.
This is my Emancipation Proclamation.
It absolutely is. It's slightly disingenuous because, I mean, of all the women in the book, she has the most privileged upbringing. Her father is an earl. She has access to the great libraries of the UK because he has so many houses and so many friends. So she's got a straight line to this, but nevertheless, she's 14, and she's admitting, oh, I spent too much time in the libraries, but I was reading the French romances. She's reading them in French and then writing them. But you know who she reminds me of in a very kind of, again, two sides of the same coin, is Jane Austen. Jane Austen is writing her socks off as a teenager. And there's a newish edition of her work, which is always, when I was taught, is the juvenilia, which is a slightly pompous way of describing somebody's early work. This new edition calls it the teenage writings. And I like that. I like that. It captures all the energy and challenge that teenagers present, she says.
And then if you look up Jane Austen, you see these 3 volumes of juvenilia that I had no idea existed. There's a whole bunch of chapters, like 30 of them.
Yep, she's prolific, and I'm ashamed to say I thought I knew Jane Austen. I really did think I knew Jane Austen, and I was worried about putting her in the book because I wanted that sense of freshness. But I went on an Austen journey, and I hadn't realized how long it took for this writer who was already writing works of spirited, if undisciplined, genius as a teenager. She was writing her novels in her late teens, and it takes nearly 20 years for those works to reach the public. And the reasons for that delay are not specific to her. And I think that is one of the points about the book, is that, if you like, in microcosm, it's so many of the challenges that beset individual women over the centuries can be seen in Austen's life. And yes, we've got the 6 novels and some fragments and the teenage writings. But my goodness, we could have had so much more if there hadn't been that kind of those breaks applied to this young woman.
And she didn't get the money, and she didn't live to see what happened. I think it's actually good we're skipping around, because everything's
okay
together. But it's like you talk about Emma Watson, not our Emma Watson.
No, yeah.
Just kind of cool. But Emma Watson, and then you talk about, you actually you ponder about these books on her desk. Oh, speaking of desks, what about her writing desk? You absolutely love her writing desk. Why don't you
I am a stationery geek. I don't have a television, but my goodness, I have beautiful ink pens and lovely books. So whenever I came across some little detail of as I say, the craft, the materials of writing, it isn't just about what goes into making a piece of vellum, or in Austen's case, the fact, and again, I'm getting emotional in my old age, that she made covers for her book manuscripts. I mean, that takes effort, and that's saying I'm taking this seriously, but it's also women's work. It's like decorating your school book. Where was I? Sorry, the question was, yes, finding out about that writing desk. To me, it's even more significant. I think it's important that it was given to her by her father, one of the definite good guys in the story. I mean, he wanted the best for his daughter. And that the best included being published. He just didn't want her to be known. Possibly she didn't want to be known publicly either, because as we still know, any woman in public life, as we would say on this side, is asking for it, is kind of bring it on. There'll be a Twitter pile-on if I say something wrong today. I hope not, by the way. I'm just trying to be nice. But, okay. Yeah. Yeah, so the writing desk was a gift from her father. And somebody else asked me, if you put all 8 women in the room together, what would they talk about? And so different, so many ways. And I thought about it for a while, and I pondered about whether it might be that all of them were struggling in some sense with the profoundest sense of the word salvation. Why am I here? What am I here for? And there are other ways I was going with it. It certainly wasn't, is there a man for me, as the biographical take, they're looking for a bloke. What I came up with is this passion for, this need for writing. So many women in this book, the ones that I can actually recover their day-to-day life, wrote every day. And anybody who tries to write will know that's the first thing they tell you in writing school, write every day, because for some of us, that's difficult. For these women, no, they have to write. They write under the most difficult circumstances. And that's why that writing desk, going with Jane Austen wherever she is forced to go by circumstance, because so rarely does she have control over her own movements. But she has her desk. She has her desk.
You even described the drawers. I just can see you. And did you go? It still exists, right?
Yes, yes, it does. And normally when I write books, I do a lot of footstepping. I do try to generally, get into the world that the people I'm writing about inhabited. It's difficult to do that during COVID and lockdown, but I did make one visit down to Chawton. And in fact, it wasn't so much Chawton Cottage, where Jane lived with her sister and her mother and Martha Lloyd. It was the big house that her brother, who changed his name, lived in. And there, maybe this was part of the pandemic or something, I had this glimpse of her always being on the fringes, always being slightly, she wasn't central to that house. It was useful to her, financially, vital, but Austen as an outsider in her own world, or somebody slightly apart in her own world, came home to me. And her vulnerability, and she's completely dependent on these wealthy men, or relatively wealthy men.
Here I go again. So my mother-in-law belongs to a quilting guild. And when you think of the 8 people together, she has one in there that they just, I hope she doesn't, well, they just don't like her. And I was thinking they would kick Margery out, I think.
Yes, yeah. I've got to mention the quilt, because that was the thing that struck me at Chawton Cottage. They've put on display a beautiful, and I checked with my kind of mother-in-law, who is a great quilter as well. And she told me it wasn't actually a quilt, it was a coverlet. So I was corrected by a lady in her 80s, and quite right too. And the work in that, the repetition, the discipline to create that. And Jane Austen is doing that, which is conventional women's work, alongside creating her masterpieces, her late masterpieces. And again, it's about what we value. And that quilt, that coverlet, touched me even more, almost than seeing, I don't know, the sugar and wine stores that she looked after. Yeah, we know she did that because people do that. But seeing her also spend hours every day doing something, I wonder if she enjoyed it. I got a horrible feeling she might not have done. Anyway, but Margery, you're right. Margery is not. Margery is loathed, or at least confuses people in almost every country in Europe during the 14th, 15th century. So there are other people who are less popular as well.
Oh, there's so many questions I have. What was I going to say? Oh, I took issue with you.
Okay, good.
So when you're talking about, I know how it is to try to write. It's so hard when you have kids, or she still had to take care of the sugar and look at everything. And I thought, well, what about like Kafka? The guy's half insane. He's in a tiny room with a deal table, and he's trying to write Metamorphosis in one night. I mean, he had it bad too.
I totally agree with you. And I think there's about 3 different ways I want to address what you're raising. One is that simply because I'm saying that these 8 particular women faced individual challenges, but also related challenges that you can track over the centuries, does not mean that men or people of color or working class people or somebody who is disabled in some way is, or whatever we want to look at in terms of where people are born and how they're born and how they live. Yes, everybody faces challenges. And what I wanted to tease out was if you like, the particular nature of the gendered challenges that these women, these people who lived as women in societies that had certain beliefs about what women should do, faced. Kafka did not actually have to deal with that. But I have written biographies of 3 very, very different men, and each of them, Shakespeare, Milton, and Sir Walter Raleigh, who is my main man, and each of them have hugely different, if we're just thinking about gender, responses to, dare I say it, the challenge of being a man. Every society has its beliefs about what men are, what they can and should do, masculinity, Should you go and fight wars? Should you write poetry? Or does that make you a bit, effeminate? And so I recognize what you're talking about. And also just the sheer struggle of being born in the midst of war, having to be a refugee, having no money. And let's not even get into issues about race, ethnicity, being the wrong religion. I could go on. So I'm absolutely not saying that every person who's born male and lives as a man had it easy. Absolutely far from it. But I do think that we have been better at recovering the work and the lives of male authors. I'm thinking of people like William Blake, John Donne, even, dare I say, Charles Dickens, Shakespeare. Yeah, he needed recovering. He needed people to stand up and say, this guy is good. We're going to take him seriously. We're going to do a collected edition of his works. We're going to start putting footnotes in there. We're going to build theatres in his name. If that hadn't happened after his death, we honestly wouldn't have the Royal Shakespeare Company. We wouldn't have Shakespeare festivals. Everybody wouldn't be studying it at high school, him at high school, which would be our loss. But that's precisely my point.
Well, we still have, just like with Jane, we still have folios that weren't published until after his death. And we know so little about him, which can get us back on track because we can talk about Aemilia.
Yes.
There's information about Aemilia that we don't have about Shakespeare. And talk about this whole dark lady thing, because I found something that I think is interesting about it.
Okay. You need to tell me what you found first. Otherwise,
well, when she's writing, she writes about Song of Solomon, and in Song of Solomon, there's, who is it? Shulamite says, in Bride of Solomon, she says, I am dark and I am yet lovely.
She certainly represents herself as dark. Dark is an interesting word in Shakespeare's time, because that's where we are. We're early 17th century, late 16th century. Dark can mean various things, and right on through to the end of the century as well. And the word black, in fact, means various things as well. It isn't necessarily a description of skin color, and it isn't necessarily a description, or it's beginning to change at this moment, as a description of kind of having a moral weight to it. This is the time when a lot of the problems we have now inherited and live with, where we racialize people, that words like fair and white start getting high value, and words like black and dark start getting low value. And Shakespeare's absolutely in at the beginning of that and playing with that. Lanyer herself, the dates don't work to have her in bed with William Shakespeare. I'm sorry to throw a bucket of water over that one. She moved in Shakespeare's world. She was actually, for a time, more successful, socially at least, than Shakespeare was. I mean, he was, in the end, just an actor, certainly in the 1590s. Having said that, I don't want to put her as the dark lady of the sonnets. I think that's just a too reductive way of reading those sonnets anyway. This is about, the poems are richer than that. We don't need to name and shame somebody. And there's a reason that Shakespeare doesn't make it easy for us, because so many of his contemporaries would make it really easy to identify who the woman was, in real life. Shakespeare says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave this ambiguous. And I think that's why they still speak to us now. So I don't want her in there, but I do want her, I do want to know, even for all the details that we do know about her life, I want to know what changed when she hit 40 or 39 or 40. What led her to think, had she been writing for years? And she produces this long, thoughtful, powerful, passionate polemic saying, don't blame women for everything that's ever happened in the universe. And even if women made mistakes in the past, don't blame women now for women's mistakes in the past. And by the way, do you know who crucified Christ? Well, men were there. And it's astonishing. Her arguments are so fresh in some ways.
And you suggest that she's the proto-feminist.
Yes, more so than many of the other women in this book. I don't think we should expect women in the past to be card-carrying modern white liberal feminists. You know, why should they? But Aemilia Lanyer does provide, she's the closest, really, I think, to setting out a feminist manifesto.
And in terms of what the bravery that's usually reserved for men's exploits, talk about, which was so hard to do, the inoculation against smallpox.
Yes, yes. Well, we're jumping forward again to the 18th century and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu going to the Ottoman East, falling in love with Islamic culture, and discovering that, hey, maybe over there they're ahead of us back in London, because they were using inoculation to prevent smallpox. And she had her kids inoculated, she had herself inoculated. She came back to England, and of course she tried to promote it, and she was called a monstrous mother. Her science was discredited, and you know, it seems, I mean, I have been informed by somebody that there's a difference between inoculation and vaccination, right, and that vaccination is what's saving us all now, or most of us now. So, you know, perhaps she was going up a dead end scientifically, medically, but nevertheless, it was a damn good start.
Yeah, they took the actual smallpox, the vaccination came from the cow, and so, but it still worked to a certain degree.
Yes.
Although,
yeah, it's grafting rather than injecting, but yeah, it still worked, you know, better than anything that they had at the time. Way better.
Over in America, it was Abigail Adams who did it, and she was, anyway. So
yeah, no, I'm here to learn.
Well, so the other thing I was thinking of, since you talked about the crucifixion, is you know, like Margery and her buddy, they basically were hanging out with Jesus, you know, like,
yes,
they were buds. But the thing about it is well, and that maybe stopped them from getting hung or, you know, worse. But yeah, the funny thing is it's like, and when you're talking about, I forget who it was that felt that Jesus was conflicted, you know, maybe Mary Magdalene could have been his wife. That was so interesting, because it reminded me of Nikos Kazantzakis, The Last Temptation of Christ, yes, where Jesus is saying, you know, why are you picking? I don't really want to do this. Could you just find somebody else and let me get married and have kids and be a carpenter? You know?
Yeah. I think again, you use the word homely. This is a very human Jesus. And if you contrast, for example, John Milton, whose work, you know, runs through my veins as if, I would not want a life without John Milton's work. But his Jesus, he can't imagine the incarnation. He cannot imagine Jesus as human. It's just not part of his repertoire as a human being. These two women and others in the book, including Aemilia Lanyer, Jesus is literally spiritually in the room with them. He is suffering the conflicts that ordinary human beings suffer. My only trouble, you mentioned Mary Magdalene, I struggle with the idea that we kind of want to marry Jesus off. Making, you know, with a wife and kids in the suburbs, and if only he'd done that. It's a bit like marrying Jane Austen off, you know, oh, if only she'd gone and married Tom Lefroy and brought up lots of kids in Ireland. It's not the only route to happiness in life, as a number of the women in the book would vouch for. And I cannot believe we're actually talking about Jesus's marriage prospects, but I come from 3 religions in my family, or there are 3 religions in my family, so I'm going to offend somebody at some point.
Yeah, it's just, I've always thought of human beings, I think the thing that's so cool about us is there's that conflict in us between the divine and the human, or you could call it the id and the superego. The idea that, you know, should a man's reach exceed his grasp, or something like that. You know, this idea that we are striving to be this, but then we're pulled down to this, and it's the amalgam, and then some of us become bodhisattvas and some of us become whatevers. And it's always been fascinating to me. And I think early on, the two women seem to have felt kind of the same way,
Yeah.
because they felt that they could, like I said, just be friends with him.
Yeah. And achieve a form of transcendence.
Exactly.
Again, it's a very loaded word, but yeah, there's almost a reverse process in the book of losing as we become more and more mundane, more and more concerned with the things of this life. And one of the things I said at the beginning of the book, and my editor, my lovely editor, Sam Carter, was worried at first. He said, there's too much religion in here for a world now in which people don't, on the whole, the Christian service, the words of the Christian liturgy aren't part of everybody's life now. And my point was, and you can tell me whether I succeeded or failed, is that it's just a different language to talk about the questions that still trouble us now. And yes, to a reader in the 15th century, certain phrases will just be as familiar as anything, and we have to perhaps look them up or think, oh, what's something like you've mentioned Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, I didn't realize that connection. I haven't got the ear for it, but the questions remain the same. And that's why, yeah, I find the early work incredibly moving, actually. And it speaks almost more clearly in some ways than some of the later writers do.
Yeah, exactly. And that would take me to Aphra, because you spend, it was so fascinating, because I thought, what's going on here? Because you're talking about the play, Rover. And I'm like, wait a minute, what does this have to do with anything that she's writing about? And you did it on purpose, right?
Yep. I mean, it was a bluff, or it was trying to trick the reader, but actually in a book about women authors, I bet everybody realized, oh, it's by Aphra Behn. But the point was that the breakthrough play, Aphra Behn's breakthrough play, when people first saw it, they thought it was by a man. And it was presented as by a man, and then she was kind of forced, you'd have to read the book to find out why and how, to out herself as a woman. And when she dealt most explicitly, directly with the hostility, very, very obscene attacks upon her. She would have, I was thinking, how would she deal with things now? She'd be on a talk show now. She'd be a shock jock. She'd be bringing it on, because she's somebody who her strategy is either to pretend to be a man or to run with the men, run with the boys. Or she reminds me of Megan Thee Stallion, the rapper, and saying, I'm just going to go bigger and bolder than you guys. And she does. And of course she gets flack for doing that, but at least she's getting out there. So yeah, Aphra Behn tried. Again, there are 101 ways to get your work out there if you're a woman in a world which doesn't want to hear your work or see your work. And one is, of course, to publish anonymously, Jane Austen's approach. Another is to kind of have your family do it for you, so that it doesn't look as if you put yourself forward. And another way is to circulate it amongst your friends, because there are no barriers to that as long as you're well connected. But Aphra Behn's is simply to pretend that she's a man, until, as I say, she's found out.
It's so funny. Who would think you would mention Megan Thee Stallion, which reminds me that I had, again, me being the patriarch in the bad sense, I'm telling them Megan Thee Stallion it's ridiculous. She's offensive. I do not like her. I do not like the way she looks. I don't like the way and they're trying to explain to me that I had it all wrong.
Yeah.
And now I understand.
Well, yes. You don't have to like what she does, but you can kind of understand the chutzpah behind it. That's completely the wrong expression, but yeah.
I was just thinking too that I gave away the only spoiler in your book, talking about the Rover. Sorry.
Yeah, just edit. I'm trying to think. There may be another one. There is another one in the final chapter.
Oh, yeah.
I introduce a young woman called Mary Seaton or Satan. I don't even know how to pronounce her name. And I'm not going to tell you anything else. And in fact, that's the only chapter in which I put a little bit saying, do not read on until you've gone to read the book that I'm writing about, because it is so plot driven. I'm a great genre fiction, pulp fiction aficionado. I love it. And it's perfect. And it would just, don't read about a book before you read it. It'd be like,
Yeah, when I saw the block, I'm thinking, well, is this part of the book, or is she actually warning me do not read on, dear reader?
do not read on, or at least skip on to about 5 chapters on. Yeah.
Well, she's the last one and the most contemporary. Yeah, the most contemporary. And who knows? She wrote 80 novels, and those penny dreadfuls, which now Americans know because of the TV show.
Yeah. Oh, right. Of course. Yes.
And supernatural stuff. And then, competing with Dickens and almost beating him.
Yes. I was surprised by that. I mean, I every day that I was investigating, this is Mary Elizabeth Braddon, investigating her life, I'd come up with a new surprise. I mean, this was a woman writing under 4 pen names at one, her own name and 3 pen names at the same time, and still turning out things. She had 5, I think. I'm so bad at numbers. 5 children. I should at least know the number of children she had. 5 children of her own. No, anyway.
Oh, well, you have to talk
a whole
about
bunch
that.
of yes, yeah. But
you have to talk about living with a married man. I mean, because talk about that.
Okay, so Mary Elizabeth Braddon, one of the reasons she guarded her privacy, slightly different from Jane Austen's reasons, was that she lived with her publisher. And again, he was married to somebody else. So Mary Elizabeth moves in with him, and she's writing away. She starts having his babies. He's already got 5 kids from the existing marriage. It's a sad and very typically high Victorian story, is that probably the wife, I always get this wrong, Mary Ann Maxwell.
I saw
she became ill, potentially what we would call mentally ill, and she went back to her family in Dublin. And for a long time, people said, oh, she'd been packed off to an asylum. There's no evidence that she was packed off to an asylum, though I wouldn't put it past anybody in that period to do precisely that to, a wife that you've stopped needing around. And so our author moves in, has children, so she's raising the disappeared wife's kids as well, and producing all these books, and one of the first female editors of the hugely popular magazines, journals, the kind of things that Dickens is doing as well. So she's formidable, Mary Elizabeth Braddon. She's absolutely remarkable, but she's also lovely. I mean, normally women like that would scare me, but she has got such a sense of humor. She understands herself so well. And as I read some of her correspondence or her journalism, or just got to know her better, there's kind of honesty about her, that she says, yes, I write things that people want to read, and I'm going to keep doing it, even though you're condemning me. And she said, people write so much about me, and not much of it, not much of it's kind. They just attack her over and over for all the things that the English can't stand, that she makes money. It's not just English. She makes money. She is living in sin, even though she's terribly respectable while she's living in sin and working incredibly hard to keep that household together. I just think she's awesome. She gave me spirit during lockdown. I thought, if she can do this, I can cope.
Plus, she's, even though it's because she's chronologically the most recent, but also I think of all of them, even Jane Austen, more about her than any other author, and you sound like it because you feel like she's your friend. But you have her own work, and you have correspondence, and you have, I guess, the whole thing, even the part with Dickens. So it seems like you were able to learn more about her than any other author. Correct?
I was able to learn up to a point. I've said she was a very private person, and she needed to be very private. She wanted to be very private. There's a moment that I dwell on in the book where she writes to a close friend, she says, I saw my name up on the billboards, and she was a huge celebrity. Everybody wanted a piece of her, but at the same time, they wanted to bring her down as well. And she wasn't comfortable with it. She said, I want people to read my work. I want to be known as a writer. I want, my craft to be appreciated. I give pleasure to people. I don't want this focus on me as a human being. And Jane Austen 50 years earlier was saying something very, very similar. And maybe the book can be divided between the people who just want to get on doing their work and be understood through their work, and probably be horrified that I'm trying to write about them as human beings, and the other people who are relentless, would have been, as I say, had their own talk shows now, and want all the attention that celebrity brings. But it's both have their problems.
Yeah, and I guess for the reader, it's very understandable because it's the same way with celebrity today.
Yeah.
The word works perfectly in both senses.
Yeah.
You get something, but you lose a great deal. And what you lose mostly is your privacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your privacy.
And I mean, Braddon tried to make sure there weren't photographs of her in circulation. So, and there are like kind of celebrity magazines were just beginning at this time. All the things that we're familiar with, though, of course, we do it in different ways now, but the whole machine, as it were, of cheap print, of celebrity culture alongside it, of photographs of the author. There's even an At Home with Mary Elizabeth Braddon, where she says, I drink tea and I vote Tory, and she cannot actually do anything to get past these two fundamental, maybe three fundamental mistakes that she makes. One, she lives with a married man, and even if she marries him in the end, even if she raises his kids, even if she's the most virtuous woman alive, people cannot get past that. They'll turn a blind eye to Dickens doing exactly the same thing in reverse, and pretty much every other author of the 19th century, as far as I can tell, had irregular family life, but doesn't matter. She's a woman. She mustn't do that. So one, she can't get past that. Two, they can't forgive her for popularity and making serious amounts of money and being unashamed about it. And even George Eliot, bless her, is furious at that. She cannot bear the fact that Mary Elizabeth Braddon's trash is earning more than her profound intellectual novels.
Right. Today would be just
fair dues. I mean,
today would be Twitter attacks between Taylor Swift and Beyonce.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But I think three, and maybe I should have put this first, for all her attempts to fit in, to present this very conservative with a small c front to the world, to behave well, my goodness, she writes strong female protagonists. And she does so, if you compare her female leads to those in, say, Dickens's work, you are on a different planet. And that is one of the themes of my book, is that there's room in our world for Dickens and Braddon. Yeah, there's plenty of room. And I'm looking at your bookshelves. You might there's a space. I'm sure you could find a space somewhere for 87 volumes.
I'm looking. I have every single A.M. Holmes book that's ever been written. Yeah, I have. Yeah, I'm pretty good at this. Pretty good.
Yeah.
But the thing is interesting. I think we may not have covered everybody, but we've covered enough that. Well, first of all, you should show the cover, because as a bookseller, yeah, I didn't even think about that.
It's already got my oops, there we are. It's already got all my stickies in there to find all the best quotes.
Oh yeah, it reminds me of your COVID blog. One of the things I initially immediately liked about you was the fact that you really like to eat cake.
Yes.
You made it a very good point that you like to eat cake, because you drilled down to the point where you like to eat all of it.
Yeah, I have actually been on a strict regime of diet and exercise since January of this year. I'm glad to say I can now fit into my clothes again.
Well, the thing about the covers is, I say this in every interview, You know, you can't judge a book by its cover, but every single person who comes into my bookstore judges every book by its cover. And this is a really
have done a great job.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And generally, the publisher does it because they want to sell books, and they don't want the author to come up with the cover because they want to sell books. But it's really good because, well, you can't really see it, but the title, you know, the title's great, the subtitle's great. But talk about the background. Oh, we didn't even talk about Eve.
We haven't talked about Eve.
And that's the whole thing. Eve bites
the whole
back.
thing. Yeah, and the scary thing is that in some sense it was just a hook. Not just a hook, it's the hook. But once, like, I thought, well, when we come to Mary Elizabeth Braddon, I'm going to struggle to bring Eve in here. Nope, it's there. All the quotes I need, all the references. And that took me even by surprise, because my, not exactly previous life, but past life was very much as a 16th, 17th century scholar and academic. So that's the kind of world I live in, where Eve is, of course, everywhere. Going into the 19th century, I thought she'd have gone. No, silly me. Yes, Eve. I was trying to make notes about this, actually, because I've written down here, why Eve? Eve as obviously the seducer of Adam, Eve who brought sin, evil into the world, death. That then, of course, leads to a theological take in which she partners with the devil, literally, metaphorically, sexually, however you want to call it. Underlying all of that, this idea of bringing sin into the world, are two things that are going to, or two ideas that are going to poison the well, as it were, for women trying to write. One is the fact that Eve, it was argued, persuaded Adam to eat the apple. She used words to gain power. She wanted knowledge. She wanted the tree of knowledge. She wanted the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So her desire for power through words, through knowledge, and her misuse of that power to seduce. And so therefore, back off, women. It's that simple. But the other one is, and this, the trouble is, I say it out loud and it just sounds absurd, but it's obviously so powerful, and it's on every page of the book, so I'll have to say it, that writing is a sin, that reading is a sin so often, or I should rephrase that, certain kinds of writing are sinful, certain kinds of reading are sinful, and that is right through the book. You should see what people are saying in the 19th century about what will happen to your daughters if they read novels. It's probably the same thing you say to your kids when they, I don't know, or I've said to my kids playing incredibly violent video games. Yeah. I'm thinking, yeah, this is evil. It's going to bring evil into mind. They're saying it's just a game. So exactly the same with novels.
The funny thing is, we're talking here and having a good conversation, and yet we're ignoring Republicans in the United States, and we're ignoring what just happened in Italy. And there's going to be piles. There are, you know, I have every banned book in the window of my store, and it's like, but it's very scary. But, you know, it's just, we're talking about this, but we should be worried about so much more.
Well, I think it's not even so much more. It's on the same continuum. And so many of the things, even the idea of developing new punishments. I didn't realize, for example, that being burned for heresy was an improved way of controlling people in the 14th century. You know, it was devised to deal with what was perceived as rebellion. So I think, I'm fired up by a sense that if ever I thought that the world doesn't need another book like mine, and the thought has gone through my mind, you know, there are other battles to fight. Actually, the events of the last few months, and perhaps even more so in this country, we've just elected a woman, somebody born female, who lives as a woman, as our prime minister. And to me, and who's just done a tweet saying, we welcome the new leader of Italy. No sense that our prime minister should be condemning fascism, open fascism in Italy. But above all, we've got to get rid of this idea that simply having women, individual women in power, is going to solve any of the problems we're facing. I'm slightly rambling here because I'm so charged up about it, but in the end, the ideas that Liz Truss or Donald Trump or whoever it is are peddling are the danger. It doesn't matter who is saying them.
Right.
And that's what we have to question, the power of those ideas and the underpinnings of those ideas. And that is why we need books, because so often they help us understand where those ideas come from and why they have so much power.
And okay, since we brought it back to the present, and in conclusion, since we've covered a lot, so, you know, okay, and the introduction, which everyone says is really funny in all the reviews, and it really is funny. And I'm wondering, oh, should it be funny? But it is. And then, you know, basically it's like, oh, okay, Eve did this, and she, all of you, brought this down upon yourselves. Say you should never have, if you hadn't have done this, it wouldn't be like this. And then, so, okay, so in the introduction and the afterwards, and even in the acknowledgements, it's like, okay, you've written all this, but you've written this incredible introduction. So what is it that you want me to do after I read this book in terms of how is this going to either, maybe you didn't look at it this way, either change the future or change my outlook or change my look at the past? Because I think you are attempting to do that to a certain extent.
That is such a tough question. I mean, oh, you've silenced me, which is quite an achievement.
Yeah. For me too.
I'm very tempted. I'm not a sentimental person on the whole. It's one of the reasons I like Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and one of the reasons I just say the courage of these women is just getting on with it, just not allowing themselves to be defeated. And I think maybe I come back to something that has stayed with me from the book I wrote about female composers, which at the time was a very, very important book for me to write for various reasons. And I was incredibly moved and inspired and encouraged when musicians, and these weren't just women, they were people of color, or might be a trans person, people who felt they didn't have the confidence in their own art, would write to me. In some cases would collaborate with me on programs, would say, I've started composing now, or I've brought out my own compositions. And I felt I was speaking to people who might not have given themselves permission to create. Now with this book, the reason I'm reflecting, am I thinking that? Am I thinking that it's going to help a writer, somebody who's writing a memoir or has a novel or what have you? And I don't think I can really lay claim to that. I think what I'm asking is for us to pause and not just say, job done, there's 50% of women published. Not just say, oh, but there are women's prizes or there are women in power. Actually ask ourselves, why are we still telling certain kinds of stories about women? Why are we so fixated on their sex lives, for example, or their appearance? Why do we still have so much problem with women in power, women speaking, women's voices, the authority of women? And these things run like a seam. It's a really tough question, partly because it scares me, because I don't think I'd write a word if I felt that pressure to affect change, to achieve change, because I don't think I've got it in me, but perhaps with other people. And maybe that brings me full circle to something that I feel passionately about, which is collaboration. We've collaborated today. We've actually had a conversation. Damn you, you've made me think.
The thing about it is, the whole idea is an interview is one thing, but a conversation is completely different. And that's what's gone now is civil discourse. Civil discourse is what moves us forward. And I'm so glad that you took such a long pause, because you actually answered the question that I asked. It so seldom happens, which is a great way to end our conversation. This has been Wonderful. The thing is, when I pick books, sometimes I go, wait a minute, do I really want to read about the history of women authors,
Yeah.
me being the patriarch? And then I go, wow, I'm so glad I read this, which is the best way for me to end for you. And this book, when it comes out, will be on our front table. And if my daughter is there, she'll run out and say, you have to. My daughter is like one of your characters. She actually does take the book, run out and say, you have to buy this.
Actually, that's one thing that I would love, is that again and again at book signings with the book about female composers, people come up and say, I'm buying this for my daughter, I'm buying this for my wife, I'm buying this for my girlfriend. So men would buy the book for the women in their lives. What I'd love to do is men like you to buy this book and read this book and talk about this book and maybe get angry about this book. I don't care, but don't just give it to your wives and daughters.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you had a cover that was like some woman lounging with on a chase lounge, I wouldn't have bought it. I wouldn't have gotten it.
No, well, wait for the paperback. You never know what might happen.
Well, thanks so much, Anna. This was a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you for taking the time. I've really enjoyed it as well. I'm going to go and get some more tea. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.